What if I told you that someone who stood closest to Meghan Markle and Prince Harry, the person responsible for managing their every public word, every carefully curated statement, every whisper to the press, has finally broken their silence? And what they revealed isn't just gossip. It's a window into a side of the Sussexes that the public has never been allowed to see, a side hidden behind closed doors, behind tightly locked offices and hushed corridors. Imagine being the person who watches the rise of a global brand, only to realize that the very people you're protecting may be capable of inflicting fear on those who serve them. That's exactly what happened to the former deputy press secretary, a figure who until now remained invisible to the world, but whose testimony is about to shock everyone. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. This isn't a story about public appearances or red carpet glitz. It's not about Meghan's fashion choices or Harry's interviews. This is a story about power, control, and the unspoken rules of a household that wields influence on a scale few can imagine. Behind the flashing cameras, behind the headlines and charity appearances, there was tension, whispers, and fear. And now, for the first time, someone who experienced it firsthand has stepped forward. The former deputy press secretary has agreed to speak, shedding light on allegations that Meghan Markle allegedly threatened staff, creating an environment of intimidation that left people trembling in silence. Have you ever wondered what it's like to work for someone whose public persona is entirely different from their private behavior? To see the charming, poised Duchess of Sussex on television and in photos, and yet witness a side of her that would leave even seasoned palace staff unsettled? This is precisely the tension that the former press secretary describes, a contrast between the public image and the private reality that is almost impossible to reconcile. Staff who worked tirelessly behind the scenes were often subjected to impossible deadlines, sudden outbursts, and the kind of psychological pressure that only those who have been inside such high-stakes roles can fully comprehend. It's the difference between admiration and fear. And fear is a powerful motivator, isn't it? Let's set the stage. Kensington Palace, a symbol of tradition, elegance, and protocol, but also a place where ambition collides with pressure, and the stakes are higher than most workplaces in the world. For staff, the job isn't just about delivering statements or managing media inquiries. It's about walking a tightrope, balancing loyalty to the royal couple with the need to protect themselves from being caught in the crossfire of intense scrutiny. And in this environment, the former deputy press secretary observed patterns that, over time, became impossible to ignore. Patterns of control, manipulation, and yes, alleged threats directed at those who were supposed to support Meghan and Harry in their public endeavors. It began subtly. The emails were polite, even cheerful at first. But then the requests grew impossible, the hours stretched into late nights, and a sense of unease crept in. One staffer was tasked with responding to every single press inquiry within an hour, regardless of time zones or personal boundaries. Another was asked to rewrite a speech multiple times overnight because it didn't convey the right tone for the Duchess. And these weren't isolated incidents. According to the deputy press secretary, there was a system, an unspoken but very real pattern, where staff were monitored closely, expected to anticipate the couple's needs before they were articulated, and quietly reminded of the consequences of failure. The consequences were rarely direct. They were whispered, insinuated, delivered in closed-door meetings where fear hung in the air like a heavy fog. You might be asking, why didn't anyone speak up? Why did staff endure this pressure, sometimes for years? The answer is simple: loyalty and fear. Working for the Sussexes is not just a job. It is considered a privilege, a golden ticket into an exclusive world few will ever enter. But with that privilege comes an implicit understanding that missteps are unforgivable, that questioning authority could jeopardize not only a career, but one's professional reputation for decades to come. The former deputy press secretary explains that they, like many others, wrestled with a moral dilemma. On one hand, they wanted to protect themselves and their colleagues. On the other, they were committed to their roles, believing that maintaining professionalism, even in impossible circumstances, was their responsibility. And yet, as the months turned into years, the tension escalated. The atmosphere in the communications office transformed from high-pressure excitement into an almost oppressive dread. One particularly chilling moment, as recounted by the deputy press secretary, involved a meeting that seemed ordinary at first. The room was small, the lights dimmed slightly to create a focused atmosphere, and Meghan entered with the poise and grace we all recognize from public appearances. But what happened next was anything but graceful. According to the former staffer, what began as constructive feedback quickly morphed into a pointed lecture, culminating in words that left the entire team frozen. The language allegedly used was threatening in tone, if not in direct statement. A line that staff members felt had been delivered to ensure they understood their place and the consequences of missteps. The fear wasn't just immediate. It lingered, affecting performance, morale, and mental health long after the meeting concluded. The deputy press secretary describes this as the moment they realized something fundamental. This was not a series of isolated incidents. There was a pattern, a methodology, a way of exercising control that leveraged both privilege and power. Staff who tried to voice concerns often found themselves sidelined or ignored. HR complaints were sometimes redirected or minimized, leaving employees feeling unprotected. And while Harry was generally seen as supportive and attentive to public perception, the deputy press secretary recalls moments when he would step in to defend Meghan's actions, dismissing staff anxieties or framing them as misunderstandings. It created a bubble, a microcosm in which only a curated perspective of events was acknowledged, and anything that threatened the narrative was quietly suppressed. But here's where the story deepens. For years, these accounts remained private, buried in whispered conversations, behind closed doors, and within confidential memos. The deputy press secretary did what so many in high-pressure roles do. They endured, hoping the storm would pass, and that their own career wouldn't be caught in the fallout. Yet, the cumulative effect of witnessing repeated alleged threats, seeing colleagues suffer, and understanding the dissonance between public image and private behavior became too significant to ignore. It was a moral and ethical breaking point. And that's why, after years of silence, the deputy press secretary has chosen to speak now. Why now? Timing matters. Recently, the public narrative around the Sussexes has shifted. Netflix projects have faltered, public criticism has intensified, and scrutiny over Meghan and Harry's behavior has reached a fever pitch. According to the deputy press secretary, the decision to speak was influenced by a sense of responsibility, not just to former colleagues, but to the truth. There's a difference between opinion and observation, between rumor and first-hand testimony, and the deputy is determined to provide clarity on what they witnessed. They want the world to understand the stakes, to see the inner workings of a household that operates under intense scrutiny, and to confront the reality of power dynamics that are often invisible from the outside. This is where the curiosity gap becomes critical. What exactly did Meghan allegedly say? Who were the staff members affected? What did Harry know, and when did he know it? And why did no one come forward sooner? These questions are not idle speculation. They are central to understanding the story. And the answers, as the deputy press secretary recounts them, are shocking. They reveal moments of intense pressure, emotional breakdowns, and the calculated exercise of authority that few outside the palace walls could ever imagine. As we delve into this exposé, it is important to remember one thing. The stakes are real. Careers, reputations, and mental well-being were on the line. And while the public sees a polished image, a charismatic couple, and media-friendly narratives, there exists a side of the story that is raw, unfiltered, and emotionally intense. It is this side that the deputy press secretary has agreed to share, offering a glimpse into the corridors of power, the strategies of control, and the personal moments that illuminate the true dynamics between Meghan, Harry, and their staff. So, what can we expect from this story? Expect revelations that will make you question everything you thought you knew about the Sussexes. Expect emotional moments that will resonate long after the video ends. Expect contradictions, surprises, and the kind of insider testimony that is rarely, if ever, available to the public. And most importantly, expect that by the end of this hour, your perspective on Meghan Markle, Prince Harry, and the inner workings of their team may be forever changed. Because the moment the deputy press secretary begins recounting the words allegedly spoken by Meghan in that now infamous closed-door meeting, everything shifts. The polished image cracks. The narrative that has been presented to the public for years begins to unravel. And the staff who lived through it, who suffered silently while maintaining composure in the public eye, finally have their story told. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. It didn't start with shouting. It started with silence, a silence that weighed heavier than any command. Imagine walking into a room where every glance feels scrutinizing, every pause is calculated, and the air itself seems to hum with tension. That's how the deputy press secretary first felt on the job, fresh from the outside world, eager to serve, unaware of just how intense the inner workings of Meghan and Harry's communications team would be. They were young, ambitious, and idealistic, believing that working for a royal couple could only mean prestige, influence, and an unforgettable career. But what they didn't anticipate was the slow, almost imperceptible shift from admiration to fear, a transformation that would define every waking hour they spent within the palace walls. From day one, there were signs. At first, they were subtle. A sigh that lingered too long in the hallway. An email that felt less like a request and more like a warning. Staff members glanced nervously at one another, hesitant to speak, careful not to draw attention. Meetings that should have been routine became exercises in reading tension, anticipating reactions, and decoding what was unsaid. The deputy quickly realized that surviving in this environment required more than competence. It demanded an almost clairvoyant understanding of the couple's moods, preferences, and triggers. One wrong step, one misinterpreted tone, and the consequences could ripple far beyond a single email or a minor miscommunication. The deputy's first week was a test of endurance. On one particular morning, Meghan asked for a press briefing to be rewritten, not once, not twice, but 3 times before she was satisfied. Each version was returned late at night, after hours of painstaking revision, only to be met with comments that felt less like feedback and more like judgment. "It doesn't convey the energy I want," she allegedly said, her tone measured yet sharp. Staffers sat silently, nodding, typing furiously, trying to anticipate the next iteration. Harry, at that moment, was nearby, supportive in his own way, but even his reassurances carried an undercurrent of expectation. Meet the standard, or bear the consequences. The deputy realized immediately that this was more than a workload. This was the orchestration of absolute control. Days turned into weeks, and the pressure escalated. The deputy press secretary observed patterns emerging, almost ritualistic in their intensity. Staff were expected to monitor every media outlet, every social media post, every public perception of the couple. Late-night calls weren't uncommon, nor were sudden demands for last-minute changes to prepared statements. But the intensity wasn't merely about maintaining an image. It was about dominance, a subtle but pervasive demonstration of power that left employees constantly on edge. One assistant confided in the deputy that they were too afraid to take a day off, worried that absence might be perceived as negligence, that the repercussions could extend beyond immediate criticism to career-wide damage. The deputy quickly understood. In this ecosystem, fear was as potent a tool as influence or charm. Perhaps the most challenging aspect for the deputy was the contrast between public image and private reality. On camera, Meghan was poised, elegant, and warm. Harry was compassionate, charming, a picture of modern royalty. To the world, the couple was a model of grace under pressure. But inside the walls of Kensington Palace, the deputy witnessed a very different narrative. Conversations that seemed innocuous on the surface carried hidden weight. Emails that appeared polite masked subtle admonitions. Even casual comments could be laced with implications that staff were expected to decipher and respond to correctly, instantaneously, and without error. The deputy realized that the line between professional excellence and personal liability was razor thin. There were moments that made the deputy's blood run cold. One afternoon, a junior aide accidentally misformatted a press statement. Meghan allegedly stopped mid-meeting, her gaze fixed, her expression unreadable. The silence that followed wasn't polite, it was suffocating. Staff later confided that they felt frozen in place, the room heavy with anticipation, the stakes suddenly elevated from work performance to personal judgment. It was as if everyone in the room knew that any misstep could trigger consequences, but no one could predict what form they would take. The deputy remembers thinking, for the first time, that this wasn't just a high-pressure workplace. This was a crucible designed to test loyalty, obedience, and composure under scrutiny few could survive. Yet, for all the fear and tension, there were moments that made staff stay, moments of genuine charm, of warmth, of what seemed like appreciation. Meghan could, at times, soften the room with a smile, an acknowledgement of a job well done, a fleeting compliment. Harry's light-hearted comments occasionally broke the ice, making staff feel human again. But these moments were ephemeral, almost deliberately fleeting, leaving employees oscillating between relief and anxiety. It was a psychological push and pull that kept them tethered, committed to the work, and hopeful that the next difficult moment would be the last. But the deputy quickly learned that hope was a fragile thing in an environment governed by high stakes and hidden threats. Communication, or the lack thereof, became a central source of tension. Meetings that were supposed to be collaborative felt performative, designed to observe reactions rather than solve problems. Staff members learned to read not just words, but the subtleties in body language, tone, and timing. A pause too long in response to a question could be interpreted as hesitation or incompetence. A too eager answer could be seen as overstepping. The deputy describes the experience as a constant balancing act, a dance performed on the edge of a knife. Every day was a test of awareness, adaptability, and resilience, with stakes higher than anyone outside the palace could imagine. The deputy press secretary also observed early patterns of staff isolation. Team members who voiced concerns privately found their feedback quietly dismissed or redirected. Confidences shared in whispers were sometimes met with subtle reminders that discretion was expected at all times. Staff learned quickly that the palace walls were not only symbolic of tradition. They were a barrier to transparency. Inside those walls, control was exercised in ways that were invisible to the public but immediately apparent to those who lived it. The deputy realized that the system was self-reinforcing. Fear bred silence, silence reinforced compliance, and compliance maintained the curated image presented to the world. One incident remains etched in the deputy's memory. A mid-level communications officer had been working tirelessly on a press campaign for a high-profile event. Despite flawless execution, Meghan allegedly expressed dissatisfaction, claiming the narrative didn't align with our vision. The officer, who had given months of effort, sat in stunned silence. The room's energy shifted, heavy and oppressive. Harry, nearby, reportedly offered measured support, but did not challenge the criticism, leaving staff caught between expectation and judgment. The deputy recalls thinking, at that moment, that the boundaries of acceptable performance had shifted, moving from excellence to near impossible perfection, with failure lurking invisibly in every interaction. The psychological toll on staff was significant. According to the deputy, employees frequently experienced anxiety, sleepless nights, and even panic attacks, all while maintaining an outward appearance of professionalism. The contrast between public perception and private reality was stark. Outside, Meghan and Harry were admired for their dedication, their grace, their charisma. Inside, staff navigated a labyrinth of expectations and unspoken rules, constantly weighing loyalty against self-preservation. The deputy describes the experience as walking a tightrope above a pit of invisible consequences, a scenario few could endure indefinitely without strain. Despite these pressures, the deputy press secretary remained committed. Loyalty to the couple, combined with personal ambition, created a complex web of motivation. They observed, documented internally, and tried to protect colleagues when possible. But they also became acutely aware of the limits of their influence. Attempts to mediate or advise were often brushed aside, leaving them as witnesses rather than participants in decision-making. The weight of what they observed began to compound, creating an internal conflict. Continue to serve in silence, or take the risk of speaking out, knowing that doing so could have repercussions for both career and personal life. The realization that silence could no longer be maintained came gradually. Each meeting, each email, Each tense hallway encounter added layers to a picture that was impossible to ignore. The deputy press secretary understood that they were seeing more than isolated incidents. They were witnessing patterns of behavior that could no longer be rationalized as normal workplace stress. The combination of alleged threats, intimidation tactics, and strategic control formed a narrative that was deeply concerning. And yet, for years, this narrative remained hidden, invisible to the public, shielded by charisma, loyalty, and fear. And the most alarming part? This was only the beginning. The deputy had seen the first ripple, but the wave was about to hit, and it would change everything for the staff, the communications office, and their own life in ways no one could have predicted. The list wasn't the only shocking discovery. Behind the polished smiles, behind the public appearances and perfectly staged photo ops, the deputy press secretary began to uncover patterns that suggested something far more calculated than simple stress or high expectations. Staff turnover, sudden reassignments, and whispered conversations all pointed to a system that was meticulously designed to maintain control over those who served the Sussexes. It wasn't just about doing the job. It was about surviving the environment, anticipating unspoken rules, and understanding the hidden consequences of missteps. And slowly, the deputy began to see the full scope of what was happening behind the palace walls. It started with noticing the subtle but consistent disappearances. Staff members would leave unexpectedly, citing personal reasons or career opportunities elsewhere. But those who remained whispered about exhaustion, mental strain, or unspoken pressure. The deputy recalls how these departures seemed to follow a pattern: a minor misstep, a moment of questioning, a perceived failure to align perfectly with expectations, and suddenly the individual would be gone. The message was clear to everyone who remained. The environment demanded total alignment, and the cost of even minor deviation could be a career-ending consequence. The atmosphere was heavy, saturated with unspoken warnings and carefully curated signals, leaving staff in a constant state of hyper-awareness. One particularly striking example involved a mid-level communications officer, someone who had been with the Sussexes for over a year and had built a solid track record. According to the deputy, this officer had been repeatedly praised for their work, yet one minor miscommunication during an internal briefing reportedly triggered a sequence of subtle but unmistakable warnings. Emails were forwarded back with pointed comments. Meetings became tense and scrutinizing, and the officer was repeatedly reminded of the standards expected in this office. Within weeks, the individual tendered their resignation, citing personal reasons publicly but privately confiding that the pressure had become unbearable. For the deputy, this was a moment of clarity. The mechanisms of control were real, deliberate, and emotionally taxing. The deputy began keeping meticulous notes of these patterns. Each exit, each reprimand, each whispered complaint was documented internally, not for personal gain, but to understand the underlying system. They began connecting dots. High turnover wasn't random. It was a product of a carefully orchestrated environment designed to reinforce loyalty through fear, maintain the image of perfection, and suppress dissent. The realization was sobering. They were witnessing more than high expectations. They were observing a deliberate method of psychological control that impacted everyone who worked for the Sussexes. And it wasn't limited to a single department. Communications, household staff, personal assistants. No one seemed immune from the pressures that quietly governed their daily lives. Emails became a central tool in this environment. On the surface, they appeared routine, professional, and courteous. But the deputy noticed patterns, subtle phrasing, implied expectations, and carefully calibrated feedback that hinted at deeper consequences. A single line could trigger anxiety, uncertainty, or doubt. Staff learned to read between the lines, interpreting not just the words but the spaces between them, the pauses, the timing, and even the sender's previous behavior. It was a system of psychological signaling, one designed to ensure that employees remained attentive, cautious, and ever ready to respond perfectly to any directive. The deputy observed how quickly stress began to accumulate, quietly eroding morale and fostering an environment of quiet tension. The tipping point came during a routine briefing for a charity event. Meghan had requested that every press release, social media post, and talking point be prepared to exacting standards, leaving no room for deviation or interpretation. The deputy recalls how even the most minor suggestions or clarifications were met with scrutiny. One junior staff member, attempting to provide context for a complex issue, was abruptly corrected and reminded that the only acceptable perspective was that which aligned precisely with the couple's vision. The room went silent. Employees exchanged glances, nerves taut, and the deputy realized that this wasn't an isolated incident. It was symptomatic of a larger, calculated system designed to enforce conformity. It was during these moments that the deputy began hearing whispers of the list. Staff spoke cautiously, reluctant to mention it openly, but the term kept surfacing. A list of people Meghan allegedly kept track of, those who had displeased her, failed to meet expectations, or even made minor errors. No one knew exactly how comprehensive it was, or what consequences might follow for those listed. It existed in whispers, in private conversations, and in the collective unease that permeated the office. For the deputy, the idea of such a list was chilling. It confirmed what they had begun to suspect for months, that the environment was not just high pressure but intentionally controlled, with mechanisms in place to maintain absolute authority. One afternoon, a senior aide confided in the deputy with a level of urgency that immediately grabbed their attention. According to the aide, Meghan had directly referenced this list during a meeting months prior, in a way that was meant to be subtle but unmistakably clear to those present. The staff member remembered the exact phrasing, though they had never shared it publicly. "I don't forget who's with me, and who isn't." It was a chilling echo of the phrase the deputy had already internalized, one that reinforced the psychological weight staff carried every day. The revelation of the list transformed fear into something more tangible, a mechanism of accountability that existed beyond observation, beyond feedback. It was a ledger of influence, quietly shaping behavior and loyalty. The deputy recalls the impact this knowledge had on staff morale. Anxiety levels increased, teamwork began to erode, and minor mistakes were amplified in significance. Employees became hypervigilant, constantly assessing whether their actions would place them on the list and whether alignment with the couple's vision was adequate. Some staffers described feelings of paranoia, exhaustion, and isolation. The deputy watched colleagues struggle silently, grappling with emotional and physical strain, yet maintaining composure for the sake of appearances. It was a delicate balance. Staff were expected to perform flawlessly while managing the internalized fear that any misstep could be remembered, cataloged, and potentially penalized. Amid all this, the deputy observed another pattern. Staff frequently attempted to shield each other from scrutiny. They shared advice in hushed tones, offered subtle guidance to prevent mistakes, and attempted to maintain morale in a high-pressure environment. But these small acts of solidarity were risky. Misinterpreted guidance could result in questions or criticism, further reinforcing the fear-driven culture. The deputy felt the weight of responsibility keenly. They were not only responsible for executing communication strategies, but also for ensuring that staff did not crumble under the pressure. A task that grew increasingly complex as the patterns of control became more apparent. The list also created an unspoken hierarchy within the team. Staff who were perceived as closer to the couple or more attuned to expectations were treated with a mix of recognition and heightened scrutiny. Those on the margins, or those perceived as potentially non-compliant, felt the pressure acutely, often overcompensating to ensure alignment. The deputy observed the emotional toll firsthand. Sleepless nights, heightened anxiety, and pervasive self-doubt. The environment fostered hyper-awareness, constant vigilance, and an almost instinctual need to anticipate every desire or requirement before it was articulated. The deputy describes it as a state of psychological strain that few outside the palace could comprehend, a tension that became a defining characteristic of the workplace. By the end of Chapter 4, the deputy press secretary understood the full scope of the mechanisms at play. It was no longer enough to perform. Survival demanded understanding the invisible systems of influence, the subtle but effective tools of control, and the psychological consequences of misalignment. Staff endured, adapted, and navigated the pressure with professionalism and grace, but the emotional cost was undeniable. The revelation of the list and the patterns it represented confirmed what they had long suspected. The environment was meticulously engineered to maintain authority, enforce loyalty, and suppress dissent. And the most intense challenges were still ahead. The moments that would test every ounce of courage, discretion, and resolve the deputy possessed. But what came next would push the boundaries of fear, loyalty, and morality even further. And the deputy would be forced to confront truths that would leave them questioning not only their role, but the very foundation of their loyalty to the Sussexes. That confession changed everything. It wasn't a dramatic outburst, a confrontation in the hallway, or a leak to the press. It came quietly, in a private conversation between two senior staff members, one of whom had been silently observing the patterns of pressure and control for months. The deputy press secretary recalls the moment vividly. A dimly lit office, the low hum of fluorescent lights overhead, and the senior aide leaning in, voice hushed, with an urgency that immediately commanded attention. What they revealed was shocking, not just in content, but in its implications for every staff member who had endured years of unspoken tension, long nights, and silent fear. The aide described instances where Meghan allegedly issued verbal warnings to staff that were both subtle and terrifyingly precise. It wasn't the public-facing criticism or media statements that drew concern. It was what was said behind closed doors, in rooms where only the staff could hear. These words, often delivered with calm composure, carried the implicit threat of career consequences, public embarrassment, or professional marginalization. The deputy listened, initially in disbelief, as the aide recounted specific examples. Emails returned with pointed comments, private memos containing veiled warnings, and even offhand remarks during meetings that made entire teams pause mid-sentence. The environment was not just high pressure. It was calculated to instill fear, reinforce control, and ensure unwavering compliance. One example stood out. A junior communications officer had been tasked with preparing a statement for an international charity event. Despite working late into the night and producing a flawless draft, Meghan allegedly expressed dissatisfaction, claiming the tone did not reflect the values we are promoting. The aide explained that the employee's face went pale, their hands shook slightly, and the room fell silent. The deputy recalls feeling a visceral reaction. The tension in the room was almost tangible, a heavy weight pressing down on everyone present. What struck them most was the subtlety of the warning. There was no shouting, no overt threat, just a quiet, unyielding expectation that compliance was mandatory and that deviation would be remembered. The confession also revealed how the alleged threats were not limited to isolated incidents. Patterns emerged, documented quietly by staff who feared direct confrontation but understood the importance of preserving evidence. Notes, emails, and private conversations all pointed to a system of influence that extended across departments, affecting everyone from junior aides to senior advisors. The deputy press secretary realized that this was not about personal disagreements or momentary frustration. It was a methodical approach to control, one that used fear as a tool to ensure obedience and loyalty. And yet, for all its precision, it was nearly invisible to the public. Meghan's image remained pristine, elegant, and compassionate, creating a stark contrast between perception and reality. Harry's involvement added another layer of complexity. While Meghan delivered the warnings, Harry's reactions often reinforced the pressure. He would occasionally interject, not to mediate or diffuse tension, but to clarify the importance of alignment with the couple's vision. In one meeting, he allegedly remarked that, "We need to ensure that our narrative is consistent, and anyone not fully aligned will have to reconsider their role." The words were subtle, almost procedural, yet their effect was profound. Staff were reminded that compliance was not optional, and that deviation, even unintentional, could carry consequences. The deputy observed how these moments created a feedback loop, reinforcing the power dynamic and heightening the psychological strain on employees. The emotional impact on staff was severe. According to the aide's confession, several employees reported sleepless nights, anxiety, and panic attacks, all while maintaining a composed exterior for public-facing duties. One assistant described feeling paralyzed by the fear of being remembered incorrectly, a haunting acknowledgement of the psychological toll exacted by repeated warnings. The deputy press secretary witnessed these effects firsthand, observing colleagues who once exhibited confidence and competence gradually become cautious, withdrawn, and hypervigilant. The environment fostered a sense of constant surveillance, where every action and every word was carefully measured, analyzed, and judged. The confession also shed light on the dynamics of secrecy and discretion. Staff were often warned to keep incidents private, under threat of professional consequences if details were disclosed. This created an atmosphere of isolation, where employees could not confide in one another without risking their positions. The deputy recalls that even casual conversations in hallways were conducted with careful consideration, as colleagues weighed the potential ramifications of being overheard. Trust became a scarce commodity, and solidarity among staff, while present, was tempered by fear. The aide explained that the culture of silence was intentional, reinforcing the sense of control and making staff more reliant on their own judgment to navigate the high-pressure environment. The deputy press secretary also began to understand the cumulative impact of these alleged threats on workplace morale. Employees who had once approached tasks with enthusiasm began to exhibit signs of chronic stress, hesitation, and self-doubt. Team cohesion suffered as staff prioritized personal survival over collaboration, carefully managing interactions to avoid any potential misstep. Even high-performing employees were not immune. Excellence was expected, but perfection was demanded, leaving little room for error. The deputy observed how this created an invisible hierarchy based on perceived alignment with the couple's expectations, further intensifying the pressure. Perhaps most striking was the aide's revelation of the human cost. Several staff members had endured emotional breakdowns, quietly leaving the office to collect themselves or retreating to private spaces to manage stress. One junior assistant reportedly cried in the bathroom after a particularly tense meeting, overwhelmed by the cumulative weight of demands, expectations, and subtle warnings. The deputy press secretary recalls their own internal conflict, a mix of empathy for colleagues, frustration at the systemic pressures, and a growing recognition that the environment was unsustainable. They began to question not only their role, but the ethics of remaining silent in the face of repeated psychological strain on others. The aide's confession also revealed how the system of threats extended beyond day-to-day operations. Staff who were perceived as disloyal, unresponsive, or insufficiently aligned were quietly documented, creating a shadow record that could influence future assignments, promotions, or even continued employment. The deputy recalls how the mere knowledge of being potentially observed and remembered in this way heightened stress, creating a self-reinforcing cycle of vigilance and anxiety. Employees internalized the rules, constantly evaluating their own actions, anticipating expectations, and striving to preemptively align with the couple's preferences. The environment was subtle yet pervasive, leaving no space for casual error or independent judgment. By the end of this revelation, the deputy press secretary realized something crucial. The alleged threats were not isolated incidents, but a pattern of behavior designed to maintain authority, reinforce compliance, and suppress dissent. The impact was psychological as much as professional, affecting morale, mental health, and the overall culture of the office. Staff endured, adapted, and survived, but the emotional and cognitive toll was unmistakable. The aide's confession crystallized the deputy's understanding of the stakes. This was a deliberate system of control, one that leveraged both the power of the couple and the vulnerabilities of those who served them. And yet, the deputy understood that even this confession was only part of the story. Behind it lay moments of quiet observation, internal documentation, and unspoken fears that had accumulated over years of service. Staff had lived through situations that were never recorded, never disclosed, but whose impact was profound. The deputy recognized that the confession was a catalyst, a turning point that illuminated not just the alleged threats themselves, but the broader context in which they occurred, a context of meticulous control, psychological pressure, and calculated management of loyalty. The stage was set for the next shocking revelation, one that would test the deputy's moral compass, push the limits of staff endurance, and ultimately redefine their understanding of what it meant to work for the Sussexes. The confession had exposed patterns and consequences, but what came next would escalate the stakes even further, revealing moments that would leave the communications team and the deputy press secretary reeling. And just as the deputy prepared for the next challenge, they had no idea that the events about to unfold would change the trajectory of everything they thought they knew, leaving them questioning not only loyalty and obedience, but the very limits of trust and survival within the palace walls. Harry's defense wasn't what anyone expected. In the tense atmosphere of Kensington Palace, moments of confrontation were often accompanied by a complex web of emotions, subtle power plays, and unspoken expectations. The deputy press secretary recalls the exact instance vividly. A routine briefing had spiraled into a high-stakes discussion after Meghan allegedly expressed dissatisfaction with a staffer's performance. Hearts raced. Pens paused mid-note. The energy in the room shifted from professional to almost suffocating, a weight pressing down on everyone present. And then Harry spoke, not with anger, not with criticism, but with a calm assertion of loyalty to Meghan that sent ripples through the staff. By the time the deputy decided to come forward, the stakes had shifted. Public scrutiny of Meghan and Harry had intensified. Former staffers who had quietly endured the pressures of palace life began to find their own voices. Leaks, documentaries, and media investigations created an environment in which the truth could no longer remain contained. And it was in this context that the former deputy press secretary finally made the decision. The world needed to know what they had seen, what they had witnessed, and what had haunted staff behind closed doors for years. This introduction sets the stage for what comes next. The initial awe of working for a royal couple fades, replaced by the sharp awareness of pressure, fear, and control. Staff endured, adapted, and survived, but only just. And now, for the first time, a first-hand account is emerging, promising to reveal not only the alleged threats, but the inner dynamics that made them possible. The stakes are high, the revelations are shocking, and the narrative is about to take a turn that will leave viewers questioning everything they thought they knew about Meghan and Harry. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. The first allegation wasn't about rage, it was about control. And in the world of Meghan and Harry, control was currency, carefully measured and quietly enforced behind the polished smiles and public appearances. The deputy press secretary had begun to notice it almost immediately. Small, subtle signals that something was different behind the palace doors than what the cameras showed. It started with the emails, polite in tone, yet demanding near impossible results. Then came the instructions delivered in hallways, whispered in staff-only corridors, leaving employees scrambling to meet expectations they barely understood. On the surface, it looked like diligence, ambition, and a pursuit of excellence. In reality, it was a masterclass in exerting power through fear. The deputy recalls a particular morning that shifted their perception from mild concern to full awareness. The press office had been preparing a statement for an upcoming charity gala, a high-profile event that would attract international attention. Every word mattered. The statement had been reviewed multiple times, polished, fact-checked, and approved by external consultants. And yet, when Meghan read the draft, she allegedly expressed dissatisfaction in a way that stunned the staff. She pointed out not just minor errors, but claimed that the tone of the statement did not reflect our story, implying that the deputy press secretary and the communications team had failed in understanding her vision. The room went silent. The tension was palpable. The deputy could feel the anxiety radiating from the staff around them, a tangible reminder that this was more than a professional critique. It was a test of obedience. What made the moment even more intense was the calculated subtlety. Meghan reportedly did not raise her voice. There was no dramatic outburst. Instead, she spoke in measured, precise sentences, each carefully crafted to convey disapproval without ever appearing aggressive. And yet, the effect on the staff was profound. Eyes lowered, hands fidgeting, hearts pounding. One junior assistant later confided in the deputy that they had never felt so small in a room full of adults, so powerless, yet so intensely scrutinized. The lesson was clear: mistakes, even perceived ones, would not be tolerated. The public image of grace and warmth masked a command structure that was unforgiving, precise, and psychologically intense. As the deputy navigated these days, they began to notice a pattern emerging, one that extended far beyond isolated incidents. Staff members who hesitated, who asked questions, or who sought clarification were sometimes met with a cold, dismissive response, leaving them uncertain whether their work had been criticized or their presence itself questioned. Even those who excelled were not immune. Success, it seemed, was never enough. Every achievement carried the implicit expectation that the next task would be even better, faster, more aligned with the couple's vision. And failure, or perceived failure, was remembered, quietly documented, and occasionally referenced in ways that left staff scrambling for reassurance. The deputy recalls thinking that this was a carefully engineered environment, a mixture of high standards, subtle intimidation, and carefully curated rewards that ensured loyalty through fear as much as admiration. One of the most unsettling aspects, the deputy later revealed, was the unpredictability. There was no formula to predict when Meghan would be satisfied or dissatisfied. A statement that earned praise one day could be rejected the next for reasons that seemed arbitrary, creating a constant state of uncertainty. Staff had to anticipate desires they couldn't fully understand, react instantly to comments they could barely interpret, and deliver results under pressure that few outside the inner circle could imagine. The deputy compared it to navigating a minefield. Every step had consequences, but the triggers were invisible until the moment they exploded. And in that environment, fear became a survival tool. The deputy also noted the role Harry played in reinforcing this dynamic. While he was generally protective and supportive in private, he often refrained from intervening publicly, particularly when Meghan's expectations were in focus. In meetings, his presence was calming, but it did not always offset the pressure. Occasionally, he would interject, not to criticize, but to justify or defend Meghan's approach, emphasizing alignment with the couple's vision and reminding staff that their role was to execute, not interpret. It was subtle, almost invisible, but the deputy could see how it compounded the stress for employees. They were caught between public expectations, Meghan's precise demands, and Harry's implicit reinforcement. There was nowhere to hide, and no room for error. The psychological impact on staff was profound. According to the deputy, several assistants developed stress-related conditions, from insomnia to panic attacks, all while maintaining a composed exterior for public-facing duties. The culture encouraged endurance, loyalty, and silence. One staff member described it as walking on eggshells while juggling knives, a vivid metaphor that the deputy found both apt and haunting. Yet, despite the stress, employees remained committed, motivated in part by the prestige of their positions and in part by the hope that excellence could shield them from scrutiny. But the deputy knew this was an illusion. The environment was designed so that even flawless execution could never fully guarantee safety from criticism. Emails and internal communications became a battleground in their own right. Messages that appeared polite were often loaded with subtext, requiring interpretation and careful response. The deputy recalls spending hours analyzing phrasing, tone, and context, trying to anticipate how Meghan might react. Misreading even a single line could provoke tension, subtly reminding staff of their place within the hierarchy. It was a constant exercise in anticipation, adaptation, and vigilance. Some staffers confided that the experience left them questioning their own judgment and abilities, unsure whether their best efforts would ever be enough. The deputy observed this quietly, recognizing the emotional toll on colleagues while trying to maintain their own composure and professional responsibilities. One day, the pressure reached a tipping point. A junior aide, exhausted from repeated revisions and late-night deadlines, hesitated during a meeting. Meghan allegedly paused, looked directly at them, and delivered a line that left the entire room frozen. The deputy describes it as a phrase that seemed innocuous to an outsider but carried immense weight for those present, a subtle, veiled warning that indicated consequences if expectations were not met. The room's energy shifted instantly. The tension became almost physical, a thick cloud that clung to every individual. Staff members quietly absorbed the impact, yet the deputy knew that the message was clear. Compliance was mandatory, and deviation, even unintentional, would not be overlooked. It wasn't just words that instilled fear. It was the cumulative effect of constant scrutiny, unpredictable expectations, and the knowledge that every interaction could be evaluated. Staff learned to read between the lines, to anticipate needs before they were voiced, and to temper their own reactions to avoid conflict. The deputy observed that the environment fostered hypervigilance, a state where staff were perpetually on alert, ready to respond instantly, yet never fully certain of success. The psychological burden was immense, and the deputy began documenting events, not for self-preservation, but because they sensed that the world might one day need to understand what had transpired behind the palace walls. Despite the intensity, there were occasional moments that reminded staff why they had chosen this path. Meghan could be charismatic, insightful, and genuinely appreciative. Harry's humor occasionally broke the tension, providing relief, if only momentarily. These glimpses of warmth and humanity kept staff engaged, loyal, and hopeful. But the deputy knew better than anyone that these moments were temporary, fleeting interludes in a larger narrative dominated by control, fear, and unspoken rules. The contrast between public perception and private reality created a tension that was almost unbearable, a dichotomy that left staff questioning the very nature of their roles, their loyalty, and their own judgment. By the end of Chapter 2, the deputy had come to a clear realization. This was more than a high-pressure job. It was an environment designed to control, to intimidate, and to enforce loyalty through psychological means. And while the public saw only the polished image of Meghan and Harry, the smiles, the public statements, the glamorous appearances, the reality inside the palace was far more complex, far more intense, and far more alarming. Staff endured, adapted, and survived, but only barely. And the deputy understood that the full story, the one that revealed the alleged threats, the manipulation, and the psychological pressure, had yet to be told. What came next would escalate the tension beyond anything the staff had experienced, and the deputy press secretary would be forced to confront a moment that changed everything. That phrase would haunt the team for years. It wasn't shouted. It wasn't slammed on the table. It was deliberate, precise, a quiet line that carried more weight than 1,000 words spoken in anger. The deputy press secretary remembers it vividly, every pause, every subtle inflection. Meghan allegedly used it in a closed-door meeting with the communications team, a line so calculated that the silence it produced lingered long after the words had been uttered. For staff, it wasn't just a warning. It was a declaration of power, a reminder that mistakes, missteps, or even hesitation could have consequences far beyond a missed deadline. This moment marked the first time the deputy realized the full psychological impact of working for the Sussexes. The meeting itself began as any typical staff session might, a review of upcoming public appearances, press statements, and talking points for interviews. On the surface, it appeared procedural, but the deputy recalls noticing the tension in the room, an almost imperceptible shift in energy as Meghan entered. Staff immediately straightened in their chairs, eyes lowered, pens poised over notepads, prepared to take notes and execute orders flawlessly. The deputy recognized this behavior instantly. It was an instinctual response, conditioned by weeks, months, and years of subtle pressure. Staff knew that any perceived lapse, no matter how minor, could result in public embarrassment or private reprimand. Then came the words. Delivered calmly, almost conversationally, they struck like a cold gust of wind. "I don't forget," Meghan allegedly said, and the room froze. The phrase was simple, but its implications were devastating. Staff members felt the weight of years of unspoken rules, the cumulative pressure of anticipating desires that had never been clearly articulated, condensed into those two short words. It was not a threat in the conventional sense, but it carried with it an understanding. Your mistakes are remembered, your loyalty is measured, and your place in the hierarchy is conditional on flawless execution. The deputy recalls a junior assistant turning pale, their hands trembling as they tried to scribble notes while suppressing a growing sense of panic. The room, normally filled with the low hum of typing and conversation, became deathly quiet. The emotional aftermath of that statement rippled through the team. Staff who had prided themselves on competence suddenly felt vulnerable, uncertain, and exposed. Conversations in the hallways became guarded. Even casual interactions carried a sense of caution, a fear that misinterpreted words or gestures could be cataloged and remembered. The deputy observed this transformation closely, recognizing the psychological mechanisms at work. It wasn't just the authority of the Duchess. It was the methodical use of silence, implication, and selective attention to create an environment where fear reinforced compliance. Staff became hyper-aware of every action, every word, and every expression, effectively internalizing a system of surveillance that existed largely in their own minds. Over the following weeks, the deputy saw how this phrase affected daily operations. One staffer, responsible for coordinating social media content, reportedly worked late into the night to revise a single post, obsessed with ensuring that it perfectly reflected the Sussex brand. Another assistant, tasked with preparing briefing notes for a charity appearance, repeatedly rewrote sections, second-guessing every sentence to avoid triggering even the slightest disapproval. The deputy recalls feeling a growing sense of concern, understanding that the mental and emotional toll on staff was mounting rapidly. It wasn't just a matter of productivity. It was a matter of survival within a system designed to test loyalty, obedience, and composure under constant scrutiny. What made the situation more complex was the role of Harry. While Meghan's words carried the primary weight of authority, Harry's reactions often reinforced the pressure. He would intervene at times, not to alleviate stress, but to clarify the importance of alignment with the couple's vision. "We need to be consistent," he allegedly said in one meeting, his tone calm but firm, signaling that staff were expected to internalize both Meghan's expectations and his own standards. The deputy recognized this as a reinforcement loop. Meghan sets the standard, Harry amplifies it, and staff bear the responsibility of navigating an invisible minefield where the rules could shift without warning. It was an intricate system of influence, one that left employees feeling perpetually evaluated and on edge. The deputy press secretary also observed the cumulative effect of these pressures on the team's cohesion. Staff who had once shared camaraderie began to withdraw, guarding their words and actions. The fear of being associated with a perceived mistake created subtle divisions within the office. Junior staff were hesitant to seek advice from more senior colleagues, worried that any interaction could be interpreted as incompetence or gossip. The deputy saw firsthand how the phrase, "I don't forget," became a psychological marker, a reminder that loyalty, discretion, and unerring performance were paramount. It was a lesson in power and control, delivered in the quietest, most efficient way possible. This environment also created moral tension for the deputy. They were responsible not only for managing the media, but for protecting the staff who reported to them. Watching colleagues struggle under pressure, experiencing emotional and physical strain, was deeply unsettling. The deputy describes moments where they wanted to intervene, to offer guidance or reassurance, yet felt constrained by the very system they were observing. Stepping out of line, even to support a staff member, carried the risk of drawing scrutiny or being perceived as challenging authority. They were caught between duty to the couple and duty to their team, a tension that became a recurring theme in their account. There were instances where staff did attempt to speak up, cautiously, hoping to address concerns or clarify expectations. One assistant tried to ask for more detailed guidance on a project, only to be met with what the deputy describes as a cold pause, followed by a reiteration that they were expected to anticipate needs without direct instruction. The emotional impact was immediate. Anxiety, self-doubt, and a sense of helplessness permeated the room. Staff learned that survival depended not on transparency, but on intuition, attentiveness, and the ability to read moods with precision. The deputy observed that over time, employees internalized these expectations, creating a self-reinforcing cycle of hypervigilance and stress. The deputy also recalls observing subtle signals of favoritism and selective attention, which amplified the psychological pressure. Staff who successfully navigated the unspoken rules were sometimes singled out for praise, while others were quietly reminded of past lapses. It was a system that encouraged competition, self-monitoring, and an acute awareness of hierarchy, all under the guise of maintaining professional standards. The deputy describes the environment as suffocatingly controlled, with employees constantly negotiating the tension between their own well-being and the expectations of the couple. The balance was fragile, and the stakes were high. One misstep could reverberate far beyond the immediate moment. And yet, there were fleeting moments of levity, brief glimpses of humanity that reminded staff why they had chosen this path. Meghan's charm, wit, and occasional humor provided temporary relief, while Harry's lighthearted comments offered reassurance that not everything was under scrutiny. But these moments were fleeting, almost deliberately brief, a reminder that the environment was one of high stakes, where perfection was expected and any lapse, even minor, was noted. The deputy realized that these interludes served to maintain engagement and loyalty, keeping staff invested even as the pressure mounted. By the end of this chapter, the deputy press secretary had a clear understanding. The phrase, "I don't forget," was more than a line. It was a symbol of the environment in which they worked. It represented a system of control, a psychological tool designed to maintain authority, ensure compliance, and instill fear. Staff endured, adapted, and survived, but the cost was high, and the emotional toll was palpable. The deputy recognized that the events they had witnessed were part of a larger pattern, one that would become central to the testimony they were now prepared to share with the world.